celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And I want to apologize today. I have a slight cold, and so my voice is going to be a little bit hoarse throughout the broadcast, but I'm well equipped with Halls, Mentoliptus, and some other drugs to keep me awake and alive during this broadcast. And you'll be hearing later from a noted author who's written extensively about the interrelationship between the American eugenics movement and the Holocaust and the Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, and others, and how too much of history has been forgotten about the interrelationship between the German Nazi Party's development of forced sterilization policies and their modeling those policies on American state government policies. We talked about this in my most recent column on Penn Live and the Harrisburg Patriot News. And I thought we'd develop it a little bit more in depth today during our show. So I'll give my opening statement, which is the column most recently published on Penn Live and the American Thinker and the Western Journal, some local and some national news publications on this very issue that has been highlighted by Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia, his recent comments on that radio program concerning the late-term abortion bill in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So we'll go through that, and then we'll bring on our special guest, and we'll have the discussion on this important both political and legal issue of the day. For this column and for my past columns and some interesting merchandise, you can check out the markscaringishow.com website. And I also want to say hello to our guests on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live for tuning in today via Facebook, and you're welcome to comment, and we'll try to read your comments on the air. And if you'd like to call in, if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, questions for me or our special guest, Mr. A.E. Samaan, who we'll hear from just after the 1:15 block segment of the show. You're welcome to call in at 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. So here we go. In the middle of last week, the Democratic governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, was heard on a radio show supporting a controversial new late-term abortion bill. And by week's end, he was admitting to appearing in a 1980s-era photograph wearing either blackface or the robes of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, of course, since he apologized for appearing in that photograph, he is now denying that he was in fact in that photograph. He has admitted to appearing in blackface, taking on the persona of Michael Jackson at some sort of dance event in Texas, I believe. But nevertheless, the photograph appearing in his medical school yearbook and his apology for it set off a national firestorm on the issue of blackface in politics in America today. And my point is how ironic that the governor is condemned by Democrats for associating himself with their own past. From the 19th century and up to the mid-20th century, it was the Democratic Party that defended slavery and gave us Jim Crow and segregation, and many joined the KKK, which was an organization that was used to terrorize blacks and keep them from the voting booths to prevent them from voting Republican. The slogan for the 1868 Democratic National Convention was, This is a white man's country. Let white men rule. Yet Democrats today have not fully purged themselves of their racist past. Hillary Clinton, the 2016 Democratic nominee for the presidency, she condemned Northam for appearing in that photograph. But remember, just a few years earlier, she referred to former U.S. Senator Robert C. Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia, as her friend and mentor, and as a man of surpassing eloquence and nobility, as well as the heart and soul of the U.S. Senate. Earlier in his career, Byrd served as the exalted Cyclops in the KKK and recruited 150 Klansmen to his clavern. Byrd was an aspiring Democratic politician and KKK leader in the 1940s. He once wrote to a prominent Democratic U.S. senator that with a Negro by my side, rather I should die 1,000 times and see this old glory trampled in the dirt, never to rise again, than to see this beloved land of ours become degraded by race mongrels, a throwback to the blackest specimens from the wilds. That was U.S. Senator Robert Byrd writing as an adult male to a Democratic U.S. senator. So my point is, forgive me if I do not congratulate Hillary Clinton for condemning Northam while lionizing Robert Byrd. Democrats' historic belief that blacks were race mongrels was not only used to justify slavery and segregation and other racial laws throughout much of our nation's history. It was also used by some prominent left-wing social activists to justify their population control policies. Margaret Sanger, also a hero of Hillary Clinton's, founded Planned Parenthood, now the country's largest abortion provider, and champion of this controversial late-term abortion bill to rid the human race of the unfit, as she would describe them. Now, Sanger took special aim at blacks. In 1926, she spoke at a KKK meeting in New Jersey. She was so warmly received, she was invited to speak to a dozen more. In 1932, in her birth control review, which she published an article written by a colleague explaining how the mass of ignorant Negroes still breed carelessly and disastrously, so that the increase among Negroes, even more than the increase among whites, is from that portion of the population least intelligent and fit, and least able to rear their children properly. Now, this was an article published in Margaret Sanger's The Birth Control Review. In 1939, she unveiled the Negro Project to push birth control and sterilization in black communities. But Margaret Sanger was an equal opportunity racial purifier. She wanted to purge the entire human race, including the white race, of those she deemed unfit. In a 1938 speech, which she gave 3 years after the German Nazi Party unveiled its racial hygiene laws at Nuremberg, Sanger urged Americans to emulate the Nazi policy of forced sterilizations. She declaimed, "In animal industry, the poor stock is not allowed to breed. In gardens, the weeds are kept down." Now, today, Planned Parenthood and Democrats such as Governor Northam, they're still at it. And they support the Virginia bill that would significantly liberalize abortion law to permit it even during the birth of the child. Northam explained, if a mother is in labor, the infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. Translation: if the baby is born alive, the mother and physician would then discuss whether to kill it. Although this bill would permit a late-term abortion for virtually any reason, Planned Parenthood and Governor Northam justify this bill on the grounds it is necessary in cases where there may be severe deformities. Translation: mothers will be able to abort their babies whom they believe are, quote, unfit, end quote. So does that sound familiar to you? And Planned Parenthood's founder wanted the government to decide who's unfit, and thus who should be compelled to be sterilized, so that they don't produce another generation, as Oliver Wendell Holmes, our former Supreme Court Justice, said, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So Margaret Sanger's policies were designed to use the government to force the unfit, as she described, imbeciles, the chronically unemployed, morons, those are the words she used, sterilize them so they couldn't reproduce. My concern is that coming next in America today? And perhaps we should condemn Governor Northam for supporting Virginia's late-term abortion bill, as well as for whatever it is that he did in either blackface or with the robes of the KKK. Late-term abortion is what should be deemed unfit in a tolerant, compassionate society that we claim to be. We'll talk more about this issue when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. I apologize again for my voice. I've got a cold, so I'm a little hoarse, so please endure. And we're talking about the big issue that has generated so much attention by the media around the country, and so many people have been talking about Governor Ralph Northam and appearing in a photograph in either blackface or the robes of the KKK, and then apologizing for it, and then denying he was in that particular photograph, calls for his resignation. But he was talking earlier in that week about this late-term abortion bill that was supported by Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest abortion provider. And the way he described the late-term abortion, how it would be legalized in Virginia and what the doctor and the mother would do in the event the child was born alive, essentially constitutes infanticide and shocked the nation. And so it's kind of developed this discussion on the history of abortion, the history of Planned Parenthood. Is there the history of eugenics, the eugenics movement in this country, and correlations between government policies in the U.S. and in Nazi Germany? And we have with us today A.E. Samaan, who is an author, designer, photographer, and some have called him an investigative historian. And he's written books and blogs and essays on this particular issue, among others. And so I've invited him to appear on the show today. And Mr. Samaan, you're on the Mark Scaringi Show. Mr. Samaan, can you hear us? You're on the Mark Scaringi Show.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, and welcome to the show, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. And we're talking about this issue, and that Governor Northam's rather incendiary explanation of a born alive situation under the Virginia late-term abortion bill. And I've written a column on that issue, and also the issue with the blackface and the KKK robe photograph that has generated so much of the nation's attention. And I've looked a little bit further into this issue, into the history of Planned Parenthood and its founder, Margaret Sanger, who believed, I guess she was a self-described eugenicist. And your name came up in the literature and the research, and I wanted to get you involved in this discussion and ask you if you could talk a little bit about, now Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood is the country's largest abortion provider. They were fundamentally involved, instrumentally involved in drafting this late-term abortion bill in the Commonwealth of Virginia that Governor Northam was commenting on in that radio show, and that so much of the country have defined as infanticide. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of the backstory of Margaret Sanger and this idea of eugenics in America.
Yeah, well, initially I tried to avoid her. She's sort of a hot potato. But as you visit the various archives in the United States that hold the personal correspondence of the scientists that supported Hitler from the United States and corresponded with Hitler scientists, you quickly come to the conclusion that you can't avoid her. Her name appears everywhere. And she was an integral part of a movement that, by and large, started in England and was matured in the United States, while Germany was pretty much in rubbles. Remember that Germany after World War I was, just a dumpster fire. So while they were a dumpster fire, people like Margaret Sanger and Ivy League progressives here in the United States were maturing the science and really the law, because that's what it is. Eugenics cannot be anything else other than a social science, a maturing of laws and control measures. They were maturing it here in the United States, and we rescued German medicine from collapse between World War I and World War II. And in that process, German scientists, the scientists that literally taught Hitler the whole notion of scientific racism. Racial hygiene is what the Germans called it. They didn't call it eugenics. They called it racial hygiene. We gave them matured laws that were developed here by foundations, groups, university departments, which Sanger was involved in.
Yeah, and I believe the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation were involved in providing funds for this. And I want to ask you about the gentleman, I probably one of the most prominent American individuals involved in this. I guess it's described as a pseudoscience now, eugenics. Harry Laughlin, who served on as an officer or on the board of Margaret Sanger's Birth Control League, and then later the Citizens Committee for Planned Parenthood. And if you could talk about his work in developing laws here in America to empower the government to put into effect Margaret Sanger's vision of sterilization and how the government would use sterilization here in this country.
Yes. Well, Laughlin is probably the most important historical figure, probably one of the most pivotal men in 20th century history that nobody knows about. Here's a guy that had a significant hand in, one, creating what was called the Model Eugenics Law. And as a lawyer, you know the role that model laws play. Someone drafts it up and subsequently states, and in this case, 30 states in the Union took that law and adapted it to their own use, but pretty much kept it intact and made eugenic sterilization legal in 30 states. This law, the other thing that people don't know, is that Laughlin's Model Eugenic Law was taken and verbatim translated into what is known as the infamous Nuremberg racial decrees, basically the legal basis for the Holocaust. Laughlin's legal methods and dictates were put in place by Hitler when Hitler wanted a eugenic state, his own little eugenic utopia. He went to his scientists that had been collaborating with Laughlin for decades and asked them, how to do it. Well, they had a ready-made law to implement. And, this is important because you hear about the miracle of Nazi Germany of enacting 1,000 decrees in a month. Well, how do you do that? Well, you don't start from scratch. You get them from somebody else. In this case, they got it from Harry Laughlin. Laughlin was also instrumental in keeping people out of the United States for almost 25 to 30 years. What was called the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act was the quota system that kept people from coming into the United States. And that's important to Holocaust studies because that is the act that kept Jews from escaping Hitler and entering the United States. When President Roosevelt, and namely his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, wanted to keep Jews out of the safety of the United States, you hear about the infamous St. Louis incident. The boatloads of victims being turned away. The law that was being used was a law that Harry Laughlin and his cohorts came up with. Laughlin was the eugenics expert to the U.S. Congress in 1924.
Now, Mr. Samaan, I want to break in here just for one quick second, and that is we're going to take a brief commercial break. But when we return from the break, I want to ask you about the eugenics laws, the forced sterilization laws that Margaret Sanger proposed here in the United States, in the state of Indiana and other states, and just ask you to tell us a little bit about how those laws worked. When we return from this brief commercial break, you're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking to the investigative historian, Mr. A.E. Samaan, and he's talking with us about the little-known fact in American and German history of the relationship between the Nazis' racial hygiene laws, the Nuremberg laws in 33 and 34 and 35, and the fact that they were based to a large degree on model laws written by an American individual in the eugenics movement here in our country, Harry Laughlin, who was an officer and a member of the board of Margaret Sanger's Birth Control League and the Citizens Committee for Planned Parenthood, the country's largest abortion provider, and the author of a lot of America's abortion bills, and a strong advocate of the late-term abortion bill in New York and in Virginia. That kind of got Governor Ralph Northam in some political hot water before he got into some more political hot water on his photograph with the blackface and the KKK. And you can check out Mr. A. Samaan. You can look at his website. He's got a great website, and that's AESAMAAN.com. And you can follow him on Twitter at AESAMAAN. And his Facebook page as well. And Mr. Samaan, welcome back. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, her Birth Control League, very much involved in promoting state laws to have government forced sterilization of those who were deemed to be unfit. And I wonder, in the 1920s and 1930s is when a lot of this movement really took place and started changing the laws of many states in the United States. Can you give us a little bit more understanding about how the forced sterilization laws took effect and were implemented?
Yes, but before I do, I want to mention one thing that's important, is that Margaret Sanger survived the Holocaust and lived for a long time after. And it is of note that afterwards she hired some of Hitler's scientists and collaborated with them, knowing full well what had just happened. You may want to look, your listeners may want to look into a gentleman by the name of Hans Harmsen, who was basically the director of Planned Parenthood for Europe up until 1980, when people complained about his Nazi past and they had to let him go. But anyways, the one important thing about sterilization laws, as a constitutional conservative, the one thing you want to know is that these sterilization laws are usually equated with KKK lynchings and that sort of thing. That's not it. The important thing to know about them is that sterilization laws are statism gone haywire. I mean, they are the epitome of statism, and they cannot operate. And Margaret Sanger and one of her boyfriends, Havelock Ellis, were very aware that they cannot operate without socialized medicine. If you are in the business of deciding who lives, who dies, how they live, what they eat, and who procreates and who doesn't, you had better have control of the entire medical industry in that nation, because these are the people who identify the unfit. And of note is that, you want to talk about statism gone crazy. Inherent in the model law written by Laughlin are the basis of totalitarianism, because not only are doctors encouraged to identify who is unfit, they are also required to do so by law. So even if you are a family doctor and a family that you've been treating for a very long time would have come to you with their infant or their child, and all of a sudden some hereditary disease is found, that doctor has a duty to the state, not to you. This is a very important distinction for us to understand, is that progressivism, as far as medicine is concerned, has turned the Hippocratic Oath on its head. Doctors do not have, under these laws, a duty to the individual, to the patient. They don't even have a duty to do no harm. They have a duty to the collective. They have a duty to treat society as their patient. And this was explicit. This is not something that I'm interpreting. This is Nazi law and an American sterilization law verbatim. You have a duty to the state and to the society as your patient, not the individual. It's society.
Yeah, and you make a very good point. And I'm speaking with A.E. Samaan, an investigative historian, who's done a lot of work on eugenics, the racial laws in Nuremberg, and developing the interrelationships between them. And the sterilization laws that Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, advocated here in America, one of which was in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Ironically enough, we have Governor Ralph Northam now talking on a radio station about how a mother and her physician can decide whether or not to kill a baby born alive under this new late-term abortion bill. And Mr. Samaan is pointing out how in Nazi Germany, medicine was transferred from protecting the individual and doing well for the individual and promoting the health of the individual to promoting the well-being of the collective. And that Virginia forced sterilization law from many, many years ago, that was challenged in the courts and went up to the United States Supreme Court. And in an 8-1 decision, the United States Supreme Court upheld the forced sterilization law in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And remember, it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great progressive, the great liberal of his day, who decided that case and wrote the opinion talking about how he was putting the interest of the public welfare in front of the interest of the individual and the individual's bodily integrity. And that is what Mr. Samaan is talking to us about, where the physician, in cooperation with the government, make a decision about your health based not upon your best interest or what's in your interest, but what's in the collective interest. And so here we have a case, and it was Buck v. Bell was the decision that upheld Margaret Sanger's forced sterilization law, where the court determined that Carrie Buck, this young lady, was feeble-minded and promiscuous. And that is apparently, according to our liberal progressive friends from the 20s and 30s and our United States Supreme Court, a horrible combination, promiscuousness and feeble-mindedness, and results in the government taking away your freedom, restraining you, and forcibly sterilizing you so that you don't produce, according to Oliver Wendell Holmes, the next generation of imbeciles. And this is what is so alarming about our own history in this country, And I fear that we might be forgetting it as we talk about these late-term abortion bills where the government is sanctioning a physician and a mother's decision to determine whether or not her baby born alive is fit or unfit to continue life. Mr. Samaan, your thoughts?
Well, one really important point to make about the Buck v. Bell decision is, and as a lawyer, you'll understand, is that it was based on due process. Whether Carrie Buck, the girl that had been accused, had been afforded due process by the state when they decided to sterilize her. But if you think about it, if you read the decision, it's a short decision, and every American should read it. It was a sham because Carrie Buck it might have received the appearance of due process, but in the end, she was accused and sterilized on the basis not even of her own fault. Her fate was decided before she was even born, because the evidence presented to the court was that Carrie Buck's mother, was feeble-minded and promiscuous. Therefore, Carrie was deemed promiscuous and feeble-minded, and even worse, Carrie's own daughter was by that basis that it was a hereditary thing. By that basis, that her daughter would be feeble-minded and promiscuous. So who cares? What does the right to an appeal provide you when you are guilty before you are even born by hereditary distinctions?
Yeah, and this is a decision by our United States Supreme Court that was lauded by Margaret Sanger. And we're going to talk more with A.E. Samaan, an investigative historian, about the racial hygiene laws in Nuremberg, the relationship with the Margaret Sanger and the eugenics movement here in this country. When we return from this brief commercial break, and we're going to open up the phone lines too. So if you'd like to ask Mr. Samaan a question, call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. We'll be back right after this.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. Apologize again for my voice. I'm struggling with a slight cold, so I sound a little hoarse today, so hopefully you'll bear with me as we talk with A.E. Samaan, who is an investigative historian and has worked on this issue of the history of the eugenics pseudoscience here in the U.S. and its relationship with Nazi Party policymakers and lawmakers in Nazi Germany, writing the Nuremberg racial hygiene laws, really based upon what American lawmakers did a few years earlier, and how this whole eugenics movement, where the government would decide who was fit or unfit to reproduce. One of the most prominent advocates was Margaret Sanger, who went on to found Planned Parenthood, and our country's largest abortion provider. And now we have Planned Parenthood continuing in its long role in this area, where today they're helping to write late-term abortion bills in Virginia and New York, where the mother and her physician would have the power to decide whether a baby who is viable in utero will be permitted to continue to live. And even in a situation, as Governor Northam described, if the baby is actually born alive, according to Governor Northam, that these late-term abortion bills would empower the mother and the physician to decide to end the baby's life. And and how this is, of course, in my view, is something that is entirely immoral. And these late-term abortion bills, thankfully, the one in Virginia failed, and let's hope it is not resurrected. But I wanted to ask you, Mr. Samaan, and to my listeners, if you're interested in learning more about the writings and the work of Mr. Samaan, you can check out his Facebook and his website, www.aesamaan.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at aesamaan. But one of the blogs or the essays that you wrote that does appear on your website, I took particular interest in, and that is in the Nuremberg trials. How the history of eugenics and the involvement and the relationship with eugenics advocates in America was essentially wiped out and not a part of the trial at Nuremberg in Germany immediately after World War II. And then you also write and discuss and talk about how, contrary to public opinion today, the Nazi Party was a left-wing, leftist political organization, and it's very different from the way it's portrayed in the media today as a right-wing, conservative political organization. Can you elaborate, Mr. Samaan?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the huge disservices of our academic institutions that have endangered us for all the reasons you state by obscuring the issue. And yes, this largely began with the Nuremberg trials, and it began pretty much earlier. I estimate, after scouring the archives, that eugenics, American and German, was identified as pretty much being the same thing, and actually the Germans learning from us. Up until about 1938, 1939, and right around that time you had the night of the Crystal Night, which was the one really resounding event that pretty much told the world that Hitler really meant what he said about the Jews. And all of a sudden, there began a distancing from eugenics. Eugenics was never a pseudoscience in U.S. history up until the Nuremberg trials and up until all the academic work that followed the Nuremberg trials. Eugenics was taught in all the major universities, and it was the product of the Ivy League universities. None other than some of the most revered scientists of the era. Laughlin's mentor, Charles B. Davenport, he was the most revered scientist in the United States at the moment. And eugenics was a product of Laughlin and Davenport and many other top scientists in Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and some of the West Coast universities like Stanford and Cal. This is where all these archives still have the evidence proving what they were doing, and it was never a pseudoscience. It was mainstream progressivism.
And I enjoy the blog that you wrote where you did this deep dive into American newspapers in the 30s and the 40s during the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And they actually did a pretty accurate job portraying Adolf Hitler as a socialist and the Nazi Party as a socialist party. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The one thing, everyone remembers that Hitler, that's a big trivia thing, that Hitler was named Man of the Year by Time magazine. No one remembers what the article actually said. And the article pretty much describes him by no uncertain terms, using the word socialist and describing the domestic policy of Nazi Germany was a socialist policy. Nazism could not be anything else but collectivist and socialist for all the reasons that I stated. If you are in the business of breeding a master race, you have to first identify the collective. Second, you got to cordon that off. who gets in, who gets out, who lives, who dies, and then you need the instruments of control, of controlling humanity the way that you would control farm animals. And to do that, you need socialized medicine. And Margaret Sanger's boyfriend, Havelock Ellis, was writing about this back in 1890. He was writing books about the necessity to have socialized medicine as the basis for a eugenic state. It can be no other thing. And eugenics wasn't a side issue for Nazism. Eugenics and what as they called it, racial hygiene, was its central theme. This is why the Nazis, and you hear this even in the stupid History Channel documentaries, which are horribly inaccurate, that Hitler regarded his war against Judaism as important as his war against the Allies.
Now, Mr. Samaan, I want to take, we just have a few minutes left, and we've got some callers, and one has been waiting very patiently. Let's see if we can get him on. Joe from Pembroke, you're on the Mark Scaringi Show.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much. Very interesting show. I did read The Last Will of Adolf Hitler, and that's quite different. It's horrible, is what it is. My number one question, though, is are these full-term abortions covered under Obamacare? And thank you very much, sir.
Well, thanks for the call, Joe from Pembroke, thankfully we've already started the repeal of Obamacare. I will say that with regard to Pennsylvania law, an infant born alive, and then if an infant is born alive as a result of an abortion, or a failed abortion, the physician in Pennsylvania has a duty to treat that baby like he would any other individual. So he has to take all steps required to resuscitate and keep that baby alive. He can't kill that baby in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If he were to do that, that would be called infanticide, and that is a crime under the Pennsylvania Crimes Code. It's a felony. So thank goodness in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have, and that's under the Abortion Control Act that was put into effect many, many years ago. We do have protections for infants who are born alive as a result of a failed abortion. We have about 1 or 2 minutes left, and I want to allow Mr. Samaan to give us some final remarks to kind of conclude this discussion that we've been having today about we have a very prominent governor of Virginia talking about a late-term abortion bill and the government empowering physicians and women to decide whether a baby born alive will continue to have the right to life, or whether empowering that woman and physician to terminate the life of that baby. And the history of this kind of ideology that allows for that type of empowerment in individuals and the government, and its roots, in my view, in the American forced sterilization movement of Margaret Sanger. So, Mr. Samaan, you've got about 1 minute left. If you can give us your final thoughts.
Yeah, well, this, for some reason, it always begins with an unfortunate infant. In Nazi Germany, one of the very first directives towards euthanasia, legalized euthanasia, was hovered around the case of baby Nauer, Knauer, if I recall correctly. And in that case, Hitler gave a directive to Karl Brandt, one of the top physicians, to go and
Mr. Samaan, I'm so sorry. We've got to wrap it up. I'm coming up to the hard break end of the show. I want to thank you so much for participating on the Mark Scaringi Show, and my listeners can check out Mr. Samaan's Facebook and website for more information about him. That's all the time we have. Thanks for listening.